South Korea and Japan, both allies of the U.S., were among the first group of American trade partners to receive letters unilaterally informing them of tariffs set by Donald Trump ahead of the July deadline on the pause of country-specific tariffs that has been extended to August 1st. With more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Tuesday, July 15th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. When the Trump administration initially postponed the imposition, that is, of country-specific tariffs to July 9th back in April, it predicted 90 deals in 90 days. The U.S. has sealed 2 deals thus far, one with the U.K. and the other with Vietnam. What's more, just days ahead of the July deadline, U.S. allies, including South Korea and neighboring Japan, were slapped with letters simply informing them of their respective tariff rates. For more on this, I have Shin Hieun with Agence France Presse here in the studio. Hieun, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Peter Lee, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
Right, Hieun, we will start with you. So, a week ago, Mr. Trump sent letters to 14 foreign governments, including 10 based here in Asia, unilaterally informing them of their tariff rates, starting, of course, August 1st. Now, Politico covered the response from America's allies here in Asia. Could you tell us a bit about this particular coverage and what have been some of your own observations on the ground?
Yes, so, I mean, this obviously came as quite a shock to a lot of officials in Seoul. So Trump basically sent leaders to over 20 countries to ramp up the pressure for favourable trade deals. And he had imposed duties ranging from 20 to even 50%. And the deadline for that would be August 1st. The letter also warned that if the countries did actually raise the tariffs, the US would retaliate with higher duties. The problem is, it still isn't really clear on whether this increase actually means an increase from the baseline from Trump's 10% tariffs, which most countries are paying right now, or if it means it applies to only those that don't apply to the baseline tariffs. So that is currently not clear. The atmosphere currently is it's a lot of mix of frustration and also a bit of confusion as well. Seoul has been going through several emergency meetings right now. Government officials are saying that they are treating the situation as a high-stakes moment. Industry sources have told me that they've expected somewhat of this, but not such stronger, blunt, across-the-board move right now. And what's really clear is that currently the speed of how the progress is going between the talks between Seoul and Washington is not going as quickly as Washington wants. And that's because South Korea has been leaderless for over half a year, and it has been in a terrible position to negotiate. And we've had an election fairly recently, and we still haven't had a sit-down with the president since. So it is clear that South Korea doesn't want tariffs. I mean, the government has been clear that their ultimate goal is no tariffs. And that is because it will be very critical if this actually happens.
Right. Peter, there's been a bit of coverage by the foreign media with regard to the response to Mr. Trump's letters from South Korea and Japan. What are your thoughts with regard to this discrepancy?
So I think, for instance, there was a bit of a sigh of relief on the South Korean part that the tariffs will not kick in until the 1st of August. Whereas I think in Japan there's a growing sense of frustration, and that's partly because they've started from different places. So as Hieun was mentioning, on the Japanese side, Prime Minister Ishiba already had his meeting with President Trump in February. They've already tried to get the ball rolling. And whereas in South Korea, it's been less than 2 months since the new government has come to office. They're still putting it together, their sort of national security team, the national economic team. We have ministerial hearings lined up this week. So we see that huge difference in terms of where these two countries have started from, in terms of how they want to negotiate with the Trump administration. I think the more fundamental question, though, is these are two countries that the United States clearly needs in terms of its China strategy, in terms of its regional and global strategy. And President Trump is pushing ahead with these tariffs on these two countries. If you look at the other sort of countries that were given letters, they're in a bit of a different bucket in terms of these are the countries where the US is trying to seek influence, trying to win over these countries in terms of its global competition, whereas South Korea and Japan are really the key US allies. So it begs the question, why is President Trump pushing ahead with tariffs on these countries? And I think, it reflects the fact that, he has a very long-standing view that, these two countries have a very distorted trade balance, that they cannot be sort of dealt with or negotiated with in that sense without, clear threats. And so I think the element of threats and pushing through until August is really putting pressure on both governments. They'll have to respond differently, though.
Right, and speaking about responding, Hieun, do tell us a bit about the package deal that South Korea under the Lee Jae-myung administration has suggested, proposed that is, to the US.
Yes, so Seoul isn't basically pleading for a simple tariff exemption. They have countered with a comprehensive package deal. And this isn't just about financial contributions, it's about trade, investment, procurement, and even security cooperation. It also includes technology sharing as well when it comes to core industries that the US lacks, such as manufacturing and semiconductors, also military hardware as well. And so, but for South Korea, the biggest bargaining chip at the end of the day is shipbuilding. And the moment President Trump took office, and then he called the then and former President Yoon Suk-yeol, the biggest thing he talked about was shipbuilding cooperation with South Korea. During the volatile eras when South Korea's leaders kept on changing, Trump kept on mentioning shipbuilding as well. Last May, when the US trade representative came to Jeju, the first thing he did, even before he met Seoul's top officials, he met with CEOs from HT Hyundai and Hanwha Ocean, which is the largest shipbuilding company in the country. And this is because after China, South Korea does have the second largest shipbuilding industry in the world. And like the Europeans, the US does lag behind. There is great concern amid that China has a growing naval fleet, and that also there will be potential conflicts on the Taiwan Strait. So basically, the US is looking for a more reliable overseas shipyards that can help them in the Asia-Pacific region. So it is also about defense as well. I mean, as we know, the US has deployed over 28,500 troops in South Korea, and it clearly sees South Korea as a defense strategic hub. And so what they do is, for example, Hanwha Ocean recently was the first non-American company to conduct a dry dock maintenance on a US Navy vessel. And that kind of authorization for a non-American company is very hard to achieve. So it clearly shows that the US considered South Korea, when it comes to all of this, as a secure security and defense ally.
Right. Meanwhile, Peter, quite a number of American broadcasters have said that the latest tariff threat by the Trump administration has perhaps reinforced the belief that Mr. Trump cannot be trusted. What are your thoughts on this, and what contingency plan would you propose for South Korea?
Sure. I mean, I think the question of whether we trust President Trump or not is sort of secondary to the question of how do we deal with this administration, right? So it's not a blind belief in President Trump's words. He's infamous for moving the goalposts in terms of what he promises and agrees to with any country, right? So it's really understanding clearly what President Trump is ultimately seeking from South Korea and how to respond to that. And so going back to Hieun's point earlier, he clearly wants certain things from South Korea. In addition to increasing South Korea's trade surplus and decreasing that with the trade balance. But there are things like shipbuilding. He's clearly signaled that he wants South Korean companies to be buying Alaskan gas, for instance. He clearly wants access to South Korea's agricultural market to increase US beef imports. And he clearly wants all US allies to be increasing defense spending, so up to 5% in the case of Europe, but also in terms of cost sharing for the stationing of US forces here, and really freeing up those US forces for other missions in the region. So there's quite a lot of things that he actually wants from South Korea. South Korea's dilemma, I guess, is which of those cards that they want to play, which of those cards that they want to fold in terms of this negotiation. So this comprehensive package, that is ultimately not just a question of trust, but actually how that is reciprocated by the United States and what will be on the table. I think in terms of a contingency plan, though, what is the backup plan in case this really doesn't work out, right? I think there are at least two factors that Korea needs to be really investing in heavily right now. And so the first is really building self-reliance, national capacity, right? South Korea has been a target of the Trump administration for a very clear reason, which is that it's a heavy industrial and manufacturing powerhouse. And we see that whether it's in manufactured goods, whether it's in ships, whether it's in Korean construction around the world. And so President Trump is clearly envious of that. And that is actually an advantage that South Korea should be doubling down on, increasing its value to the United States and other allies. I think the second part, though, is a bit of a balancing strategy. Korea needs to be working much more with other like-minded countries, whether that's Japan, Australia, Canada, and others in Europe, really to build that sort of collective resilience in terms of, proofing themselves from US coercion or US unilateralism. And so we see things like growing interest in South Korea joining regional free trade agreements like the CPTPP. And those are things that Korea has largely shunned for a long time because it thought it had the benefits of the Korea-US free trade agreement. Now I think the time has come to build that greater collective resilience with other countries as well. So those are probably two contingency plans that need to be put in action alongside these negotiations.
Right. The new government also, Hieun, has been seeking a summit between President Lee Jae-myung and US President Donald Trump. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Lee Jae-myung administration has only been in power for about 6 weeks now. Where do we stand with regard to prospects of a summit between South Korea and the US?
So a summit between President Trump and President Lee can become a linchpin for resolving the tariff issues and also even defense discussions as well. But the problem is the timeline is very, very tight. I mean, National Security Advisor Wee Sung-lak did meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and we did say that he did discuss potential dates for summits as well, and also Rubio expressed his agreement in that both of them could make an agreement on mutually beneficial results as well. But the problem is Rubio isn't Trump, and Trump needs to come to the table and talk to Lee. And in order to do that, there needs to be many, many talks beforehand, including smoothing out all these small little deals, including, as Dr. Lee mentioned, agriculture, shipping, and even defense corporations as well. And so it's a very complex process that will take a very long time. And currently we have only 2 weeks left till it's August. And there are also talks that Trump is also going on a summer holiday before August 1st as well. And if that actually happens, that would actually make the timeline much tighter as well. So currently we have said that they are also talking about a backup plan as well, which is to have talks after August 1st, but obviously that is not ideal, and the tariff negotiations need to happen beforehand, also before a lot of the Asian countries as well. Also, the problem is Trump needs to have talks with hundreds of more countries for all these tariffs. So it does look like a long shot, but I don't think it is impossible.
Right. Peter, the Lee Jae-myung administration has highlighted the importance of a pragmatic approach to trade, diplomacy. How likely is this particular strategy, keeping in mind, of course, Mr. Trump's pressure on America's partners to contain China?
So in a sense, I mean, President Trump is also pursuing the quintessential pragmatic foreign policy in his own way, right? He's really, overthrowing and unending, decades of American foreign policy assumptions and norms. And so we see this sort of perfect storm in many ways of leaders that are moving away from the well-worn scripts that we've had in terms of Korea-US relations for the last 80 years. So it's very dangerous and risky territory in some ways, but it's actually a chance to update things that have been sitting there for quite a long time that needed to be changed. And so just, I guess, two of the really good examples are President Trump raising the issue of the tariffs in terms of the trade balance, right? So this has been a long-standing grievance on the US side that South Korea runs a very high trade surplus. And it has not changed, right? And so President Trump is now usually basically, blown everything up in terms of having that discussion. But on the South Korean side, there's another debate, which is the role of USFK, US forces here in Korea, that President Trump has also, I think, blown up that debate in terms of where the ROK-US alliance is focused, where US forces on the Korean Peninsula are a mission sort of set. So those are two really huge debates that President Trump has really, changed the way, right? And I think President Lee Jae-myung really needs to find that pragmatic solution. I say that, pragmatism means you can update your prior assumptions, you can be flexible. So in that sense, South Korea also needs to show, what it wants from the US that it might not have already had the opportunity to have those discussions on. So this is a time where South Korea can put on, new demands, new asks, new requests that perhaps in the past American leaders would have said no to. So I think there is a quid pro quo to be had if you are going to be pragmatic about this. It doesn't just go one way. I think Korea should also be putting forward its own demands. And so we see questions around the role of US extended nuclear deterrence, the role of the US in the region, how the US is going to deal with North Korea. These are questions where South Korea has its own questions and grievances for a long time. So this is a chance to have those debates as well. It's not just a one-way street.
Right, good to know. Hyun, for the sake of comparison, meanwhile, could you tell us a bit about the tariff rates set by the Trump administration on its biggest trade partners, including, of course, Canada, Mexico, and, of course, the EU as well?
Yeah, so the Canadian and Mexican products were imposed with 25% tariffs when after Trump shortly took the office. And so they were already facing higher tariffs than before. But but Canadian energy resources, however, did face lower rates. And then, obviously, as we know, last week, Trump sent all these letters, including to Canada, and Canada was imposed with 35% tariffs, which is relatively higher than compared to its other allies. A lot of the products under the United States-Mexico-Canadian agreement will be expected to be exempt, and also Canadian energy resources and also potash, which is usually used as fertilizer, will be facing lower rates than before. The Canadian government has said that they are facing this unpredictable administration, but as you can see, they do have a lot of negotiation cards, including their energy resources, which they can use for the deal. So it does look like Canada can make a negotiation, but it's all about how they will be able to talk to the president at the same table. The Mexican government also faced with 30% tariffs as well, and actually just yesterday they were faced with 70% anti-dumping tariffs on Mexican tomatoes coming into the United States. And so the Mexican government has reiterated that this is a completely unfair deal and they do not agree with it. The EU also did face 30% tariffs as well. And the European Commissioner Chief has said that this will actually disrupt the essential transatlantic supply chain, and they are trying to find an agreement as soon as possible. For the EU, this is really critical because when it comes to Ireland's pharmaceutical industry and also Germany's exports, such as steel or automobiles, it will highly affect them if the tariffs are actually imposed.
Right. Some regional scholars, Peter, believe that Mr. Trump's tariff campaign, if you will, can be considered to be a gift for China. Do you share this sentiment? Do you believe China can replace the US as a regional trade partner?
So setting aside the second part of that question, I think it's clearly been a great gift for China in terms of the 14 countries that received letters, right? You think about, taking aside South Korea and Japan, many of the other countries were countries that the US has spent years cultivating relations with, trying to gain influence and win over, right? The US is in a global competition for influence against the PRC right now. And so the US has really shot itself in the foot in terms of putting down unilateral tariffs on countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and elsewhere. So we look at that, and then we add to the tariff question, right? The US is clearly under the Trump administration, receding from international institutions like the UN, Human Rights Commission, elsewhere like, for instance, if you think about the WHO, President Trump has threatened to leave the WTO. If you think about defunding, the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, these are all areas where really the US was engaged in a global competition for influence and leadership. And so the withdrawal from all of these areas, I think, is going to create a huge vacuum, which is a great gift for the Chinese in terms of trying to build their own influence. Having said that, I think everybody knows that the world in which China shows its own leadership has its problems of its own. And so we look back even a few years to the pandemic, to before the pandemic, where the PRC was leveling its own informal sanctions and coercion against many of these same countries. So I think most of the region, most of the world knows what coercion looks like from whichever great power is leading that. I think the US case is a bit new, and so it's so shocking because it is so unexpected. But I think whether countries will now shift purely to a China-centric world, I think that's still an open debate. I think countries have realized that they can't rely on solely the US or solely China. And so they're going to have to find new ways to manage their own security, their own economic security. I think that's really the wake-up call for a lot of countries right now.
Right, including South Korea, of
Including
course.
South Korea.
Right. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Peter, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Pleasure.
And Hieun, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.